There are a few more people coming. We'll start in a minute. Can everybody hear me? No. Now can you hear me? Oh, I can hear myself. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen Martin, and I'm going to happily introduce you to Mills Kelly, author, historian, podcaster, photographer. And today, can you hear me now? It's too loud. Now? Okay. Mills is a retired professor from George Mason University and spends a lot of time on the Appalachian Trail. And today he's going to give a talk about the Lost Appalachian Trail of Virginia. After the talk, he has brought some books, and they're going to be for sale. If any of you would like to get an autographed book, they're going to be $20 and $23.99, cash or card. There are two other topics that I want to mention. He's on the board of the Handmade Music School in Floyd, Virginia, and maybe he'll spend a couple of minutes talking about that. And teaching history in the digital age, a topic that we're going to maybe have you come back and talk another time about that. So without further ado, here's Mills Kelly.
Ellen, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here on this rainy spring morning. It's hard to believe that it's this chilly outside after it being so hot, 2 weeks ago? We were broiling, and I'm sure the poor flowers are just very, very confused at this point. So I live actually now full-time in Edenton, North Carolina. Has anybody been to Edenton? So lots of you, that's great. So you know it's an absolutely beautiful little town on the coast on the Albemarle Sound and the first colonial capital of North Carolina. We just moved down there last year after I retired from George Mason. And I will say my flowers are very confused. It's because it was 96 degrees 2 weeks ago, and this morning I woke up, it was 41. So I don't know what's going on with all that. Today I want to tell you a little bit about a really interesting part of the history of the Appalachian Trail. And you'll also hear me occasionally cycle between Appalachian and Appalachian. And that's because I'm originally from Appalachia. My father was a professor at Ferrum College in Franklin County, which affectionately markets itself as, or proudly markets itself as the moonshine capital of the world. According to local lore, during the period of Prohibition, more sugar was offloaded at the railroad station in Rocky Mount than in Richmond. And I don't know what they were doing with all that sugar, but I have some ideas about what it might have been used for. So I was originally from Franklin County, and that will be relevant in a few minutes in my talk. But we moved to Northern Virginia when I was young, and so in Franklin County it's the Appalachian Trail, and in Falls Church in Northern Virginia it's the Appalachian Trail. And the dividing line between Appalachia and Appalachia is for sure the Potomac River. But more practically, it seems to be about Charlottesville. Everybody south of Charlottesville says Appalachia. Everybody north of the Potomac River says Appalachia. And there's this gray zone in between that's mostly occupied by Shenandoah National Park. So you'll hear me, I grew up saying Appalachian Trail, but as I've worked on the history of the trail, I've come to remember that it's, for some folks, it's the Appalachian Trail. So you'll hear me say both, and if you're from north of the Potomac, you tend to not care about that. And if you're from south of Charlottesville, you really care about that. So for those of you who do really care, when I say Appalachian, you'll know that I just kind of go back and forth because of my upbringing. So As Ellen said, I'm a historian. I taught at George Mason for 24 and a half years, and would have taught for 25, but the early retirement offer meant that I had to skip that spring semester. So 24 and a half. George Mason is a truly wonderful university. If you haven't visited, it is the largest university in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's also the newest. And we became a university in the late 1960s, around the time that Old Dominion started as well. But it's also the most diverse large university in the United States. And it's just a really marvelous, marvelous place to have taught all those years. And at some point, I can't remember exactly when, I think it was about 2012, 2013, my interest as a historian shifted from European history, which I'd done most of my career, to American history, and that was largely so that I could work more closely with undergraduate students who were interested in doing their own research, and they didn't have any of the language skills that were necessary to do the work that I had done previously. So I switched to American history so I could work with them, and that late in my career, I could choose just about anything I wanted to do, and I've been hiking on the Appalachian Trail since 1971, and when I was a young Boy Scout, and so I thought, well, I'll just do that, because that's what I like. And so that's the advantage of being later in your career as a historian. You get to choose whatever you want. So I decided to write a history of the Appalachian Trail, and in 2016, I started researching it pretty seriously in the archives. And so this is the trail. It runs from Springer Mountain in Georgia all the way up to Mount Katahdin in Maine. And this year, it's 2,197.4 miles long. Changes a little bit every year, but I'm going to talk today about what happened in Southwest Virginia, where that red arrow is pointing, because the single biggest change in the route of the trail occurred there. And when the trail was first laid out in 1930 in this part of the country, from Roanoke down to Damascus, which is right on the Tennessee border, there's about 300-mile long stretch of the trail there, and that roughly followed the route that the Blue Ridge Parkway follows today, but for reasons we'll see, it changed a lot in 1952 because the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, or conference in those days, they decided to reroute the trail in 1952, and so they moved 300 miles of the trail 50 miles to the northwest. And so I'll tell you the story of that, and that's kind of, as I was doing my initial research on the history of this trail, which is probably the most famous hiking trail in the world, I ran into a problem, and the problem is this. Archives, that's also just one more map. The blue line on the map there is the current route of the trail today. The red line is the route that it took from 1930 to 1952. So you can see it's a really big difference. So here's the problem that I ran into. So archives, if you're a historian or a genealogist, archives are really dangerous places. And the reason they're dangerous is because rabbit holes open up in front of you all the time. And you know from the story of Alice in her visit to Wonderland, a rabbit hole opened up in front of her, and she went and peered down into that rabbit hole, and then she jumped in and had all sorts of very strange adventures. But if you're working in the archives as a historian or a genealogist, these rabbit holes open up constantly. And I used to tell my students that it was their moral obligation to stand at the edge of that rabbit hole and peer down into it to see what might be down there. But that most of the time, meaning about 99% of the time, they should back away from the rabbit hole because they had work to do. They had a deadline. Semesters are only 14 weeks long. You know, you can't just jump into every rabbit hole that you see. I, on the other hand, was not on a deadline. And so here's the rabbit hole that I ended up in. I was doing some initial research and looking at old letters and documents like this one, and I saw this letter from a man named Myron Avery, who was the rising star of the Appalachian Trail Project, to his boss, a judge up in Connecticut named Arthur Perkins. And Avery was trying to get the trail completed. It started in 1921, and he was just hell-bent on getting that project done because he wanted a really big accomplishment in his life, and that would be a really big accomplishment. And so they had the whole thing kind of plotted out by 1929, except for southwestern Virginia. And the reason was they didn't know anybody there. And it's also, for those who know that part of the state, it's a very rural place. The biggest town in 1929 was Galax, and it's still the biggest town. And at the time, it only had a population of about 2,000 people. Floyd, the next biggest town, had a population of about 500 people. And Hillsville was next with about 400 people. So it was a very, very rural place. And the Appalachian Trail was and still is a volunteer-led project. It's the only it's a national park now, but it's the only national park run entirely by volunteers. And so they just didn't know anybody who could help them in that part of the state. And then one day, Avery got a letter from a man in Floyd. He was the county agent in Floyd, Virginia. His name was Shirley Cole. And Cole wrote to Avery, and he said, I understand that you're having a difficult time figuring out where to route the Appalachian Trail through my part of the state. I have solved that problem for you. Here's where it should go. And most people would say, oh, that's great. Thank you. But not Myron Avery. He wasn't that guy. Myron Avery believed that the Appalachian Trail was his project, not some county agent in Nowheresville, Virginia. And so he got upset. Instead of being thankful, he got upset. And here's a picture of Shirley Cole and his brother at their little cabin on Cockram Ridge down in Patrick County. And that's a photo from about 1925, and which I got from his daughter, Shirley Cole's daughter. When she gave me that photo in 2019, she was 97. So as part of this project, I spent a lot of time with folks older than my parents. So, and I'm 67. So Avery wrote to the man in the cowboy hat there. His name was Roy Osmer. He was a forester in Georgia, in the Georgia Forest Service, and he had scouted the route of the trail in Georgia the previous year. And he wrote to Osmer, and he said, Roy, I need you in Virginia. I need you to come up to Virginia right away, because we can't, and this is exactly what he wrote, we can't let those people in Floyd decide where our trail should go. Those people. Not exactly the most polite way to put it. Also, by the way, I love this photo because that's Roy Osmer's boss next to him. And you'll notice he's got a 6-shooter stuck in his belt. I guess if you were in the Forest Service in Georgia in the 1920s, you needed to walk around with a 6-shooter, maybe because the moonshiners were a problem. I don't know. But so Osmer, he says, I'm on it. I'll be right there. You know, I guess in 1929, if you worked for the Georgia Forest Service, you could just walk away from your job for 6 weeks without any problem and drive up, take a bus up to Virginia, take the train up to Virginia, and go scout out some trail, and then go back to work. But that's what he did. And so so Osmer, he goes off to start scouting the trail, and he begins in Roanoke and starts working his way south. And the route that he took was a very ancient route in Virginia, because along the edge, it's right where the Blue Ridge Parkway goes today, along the edge of that ridge line there, that escarpment of Southwest Virginia, the Cherokee had put in a path 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, nobody knows for sure, but it was part of their warrior path. And then when colonists moved into the area in the early 18th century, well, there was a path, and it went right along the ridge line there, and so they just co-opted it and turned it into a road, and it became known as, depending on which direction you were going in, it was either the Philadelphia Road if you were going north, or the Carolina Road if you were going south. And it was an old kind of tote road that wagons would go north and south with goods for market, either in Philadelphia or down into the Carolinas. And so Osmer starts trying to follow that route, and he gets lost. that part of the state was, as I said, very, very rural, and lots of little streams cutting through the route. And he would go down in the little stream valley, and he'd come back up, and then he couldn't figure out where he was. And so he finally did the thing he was not supposed to do. He got a ride into Floyd, and he looked up that Shirley Cole character, and he said, "Mr. Cole, could you possibly help me with the routing of this trail?" And Cole, of course, said, "Yes, I already have an idea where it should go." And so the two of them spent several weeks together, and then Osmer wrote this 11-page report to Myron Avery saying, "I have solved the problem of the trail in Southwest Virginia." And he lays it out step by step by step. And in the very last paragraph on page 11, he says, "And Mr. Shirley Cole of Floyd, Virginia, was extraordinarily helpful to me in this endeavor." Avery then writes the letter that I showed you a minute ago, this one, and he sends it up to Judge Perkins, and he says, "We have solved the problem of Southwest Virginia. We've solved it." He never mentions Shirley Cole. He does say that Roy Osmer, who scouted the trail in Georgia, was extraordinarily helpful to us. And so now we've got it all solved. And it was that letter that was my rabbit hole, because it laid out this whole thing, and it said something about the route of the Appalachian Trail going along the boundary between Floyd County and Franklin County, where I'm from. And I thought to myself, the Appalachian Trail doesn't get anywhere near Franklin County, Virginia. I mean, it's 50 miles away. And so there I was, standing at the edge of the rabbit hole, and I thought, well, I got to jump down in there and see what's going on. And if I hadn't been from Franklin County, I'm quite certain that I would have just backed away from the rabbit hole and gone on with what I was doing. Instead, I jumped in and I started researching it. And the more I researched it, the more I realized the archives weren't going to tell me the story, which is an unusual thing for a historian to say, because we do love a good archive. But I just realized it wasn't going to tell me the story, and so I resorted to desperate measures. As I told my students, I resorted to desperate measures. I got in my car and I drove south. And I started driving around in southwestern Virginia along the route that the trail used to take, and I just started talking to people. So just to give you an idea, this is what a lot of the trail route looks like today. Old gravel roads, and because a lot of the Appalachian Trail was on old gravel roads when it was first created, because that was an expedient way to get a trail across 14 states. And so you can see it's kind of foggy there. That's near Fancy Gap, where the interstate today carves up from down around Winston-Salem, gets up toward Roanoke or Wytheville. And the original name for Fancy Gap, by the way, was Foggy Camp, and I think you can see why. This part of the state is one of the foggiest places I've ever been in my life. It's just foggy all the time. And the old trail guides were actually real helpful to me, because they were step-by-step instructions. And so this is a primitive Baptist church along the Blue Ridge Parkway, but it was on what was a gravel road at the time. And the directions say, go until you get to the Mount Zion Primitive Baptist Church, turn left on Pee Wee Lane and walk 1/4 of a mile, and then turn right on Hummingbird Lane, and just step by step. And so I could, in my car, sort of putt-putting around with the trail guide, trying to figure out where it all went. And some parts were a little more decrepit than others. This was the Edwardsville store. I took that picture in 2019, somebody recently had shored up the porch there so it wouldn't fall down, but it's not a store anymore. But in 1935, the trail guide said, and be sure and stop at the Edwardsville store where you can buy supplies for your hike, etc. So I was just driving around and asking people, and my favorite moment from all of that was I was in Fancy Gap, and I went into the Lakeview Diner, which was a bit of a puzzle to me because there was no lake. And no evidence that there had ever been a lake. And so I was sitting at the counter having a good old Southern breakfast of bacon, eggs, grits, toast, coffee, and I said to the waitress, I said, "So why is it called the Lakeview Diner?" because I don't see a lake. And she laughed and she said, yeah, people ask that once in a while. Yeah, there was never a lake. I think she said she thought they said that just to like get tourists to come in and drive, because you used to have to drive a really twisty road up through the gap. And she said, and there used to be a Lakeview motel. And they must have really been disappointed if they thought they had booked into a motel with a lake view, because there was no lake. But so I said to her, did you know that the Appalachian Trail used to run right past the front door of this diner? Because it did. And she said, no, I didn't know that. And I said, well, yeah, it just ran right up the road here, right past the front door. And she said, well, that's pretty interesting. And I said, so does anybody from around here, they ever talk about that? Because I was just trying to find somebody who would remember it. And she said, well, Charlie does. And I said, oh, that's great. Does Charlie have a last name? And she thought about it, and she said, well, I'm sure he does. I said, do you know it? No. I said, well, how often does he come in? Because I'm thinking, well, if he's coming in every Tuesday, I could arrange to be here, you know. And she says, well, he comes in pretty often. And I said, like, how often? Like every week? No, but pretty often. And I thought, you know, I'm going to have to eat a lot of grits if I'm going to meet Charlie. So I never did meet Charlie. But as I kept driving around and talking to people, I got a little bit more specific advice about who to talk to. And so slowly but surely, I started learning more about who the people were who could remember the trail. And the more I talked to those folks, the more I realized I was working on an entirely different book. I thought I was writing a book about the kind of administrative decisions that the Appalachian Trail community made when they rerouted the trail, this big, huge change in the trail. But I realized I was writing a whole different book. And what I was writing was a book about people and the landscapes that they lived in and the way that they remember things that are important to them. So just to say a little bit about those landscapes first, this is the Pinnacles of Dan. I'm not sure why it's plural pinnacles, because there's only one, but nobody ever could explain that to me. But it's in the Dan River Gorge at the headwaters of the Dan River. And the trail used to go up one side and down the other. Just straight up one side and straight down the other. And hikers who hiked that section described it as the second most difficult part of the entire trail. Mahoosic Notch up in New England always gets to be first as the most difficult. Nobody ever argues that point, but the Pinnacles of Dan were described as the second most difficult. The Dan River Gorge is filled with waterfalls, absolutely beautiful waterfalls. Some of them, unfortunately, are under a lake now because in the late 1930s, the city of Danville built a power supply dam there, which is now owned by a Swedish company. But this is the Great Falls of Dan, and it is still there, still visible. You can still see it, but some of the most beautiful waterfalls are gone. The Appalachian Trail has a long history of having trailside shelters that people can stop at, have a picnic, or spend the night if they choose. This is the only shelter that was built along the section of trail that I was interested in, and it would not be allowed today. And the reason it would not be allowed, first of all, you can tell just by looking at it that it was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s because they built with rocks and cement. The CCC crews were big believers in cement. And so this shelter is as solid today as it was when it was built in the 1930s. But the reason it wouldn't be allowed today is you can sort of see in this photograph, which I took just a couple of years ago, that it's right at the edge of the cliff. And it's about 6 feet from the edge. And there's no way that the National Park Service would allow a shelter to be built 6 feet from the edge of about a 300-foot drop. So I have these visions of hikers waking up in the middle of the night, needing to step outside for just a minute and forgetting that they were 6 feet from the edge and having a bad ending to their hike. But this is a very historic part of the state, and people's historical memories there are very, very important to them. So everybody I would talk to, they would say, well, you know about the courthouse shooting in Hillsville, right? And I'd say, no, never heard of that. You haven't heard of that? Because it was the biggest thing that had ever happened in that county. Biggest thing, bigger than the Civil War, much bigger, because the Civil War didn't really happen there. Just men were recruited or volunteered for either side. And, but this is the home, this is the biggest house in the whole county, and in Carroll County, Virginia. And it's the Allen family home, and Sidna Allen. And the Allen brothers were very famous for the courthouse shooting, because what happened was in about 1905, Sidna's older brother, Floyd, was arrested for assaulting a sheriff's deputy. And the reason he had assaulted the sheriff's deputy was that the deputy was breaking up his whiskey still, and he didn't appreciate that. And so he took the sheriff deputy's gun and beat him with it, and then broke it over a rock and then left him there. And so he got arrested, and they went to trial. He went to trial, and the judge in the case made a big mistake, and that was he chose not to disarm people coming into the courthouse, because he said that they were not on trial for their weapons. They were on trial for, this man was on trial for assaulting a sheriff's deputy, which was different. Had he disarmed them, he would have survived that day. Instead, when Floyd Allen was convicted and the judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison, he stood up in the box and he said, "Judge, I ain't a-going." And he pulled a pistol out of his pocket and shot the judge dead on the spot. And then everybody started shooting, and before you knew it, 7 people were dead, including the entire government of that little town. So they had to actually telegraph to Richmond and ask for help, because the sheriff and one of his deputies ran away, and the other one died along with the sheriff. So they had no law enforcement, no government, no nothing. And so the government here in Richmond had to send a private detective agency from Roanoke, the Phelps Detective Agency. These guys, it was like Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral. They rode down on a flat car with their horses and their Winchester rifles, and everything. I mean, this was the 20th century, and yet they imposed order on the town. Sidna Allen, who was one of the people who involved in the shooting, was actually apprehended by the Phelps Detective Agency in Iowa about a year later, and his house was given to his attorney to pay off his debts to his attorney. He ended up getting 20 years in prison, but the reason this comes into the story is that the attorney then sold the house to a man named Webb. And by the time the Appalachian Trail came around, Mr. Webb's wife, Irma, still lived in that house, and she would take in boarders who were hiking along the trail. And so they'd pay her $1, and they'd get dinner, a bath, and breakfast. So what are the odds that over dinner, she did not tell them the story of the courthouse shooting? Of course she had to. That was the biggest thing that had ever happened, and people in 2019, people were still asking me about it. Hikers sometimes along the Appalachian Trail stay in hotels. This is the one they would stay in Galax, the Bluemont Hotel, which sadly burned in the 1960s, so it's part of an invisible landscape now. Sometimes they stayed at fire towers like this one. There are not many fire towers left in the state. They're mostly gone. This is when the trail crossed over the New River and started heading down toward the Grayson Highlands. This is a view of the Grayson Highlands in the distance, the highest mountains in the state, but it's from Skulls Gap, just north of the Grayson Highlands. And then eventually it made it all the way down to Damascus and the little train station there in the 1940s. Damascus today is the home of the Trail Days Festival. It's the Appalachian Trail Days Festival, which happens in 3 weeks. And about 5,000 hikers will descend on Damascus for 3 days of fun. And Damascus's regular population is about 550. So you can imagine it's like a NASCAR race for them to have all those hikers there spending money. But so I learned a lot, between the archives and talking to some people. But like I said, the most important thing I learned was how important the story of the Appalachian Trail was to people's lives. So the first person I want to tell you about is a man who I became very close friends with named Doug Bell. Doug sadly passed away just a year ago this week. And he was a manager for the Lowe's Corporation his whole career, and he was from Floyd, Virginia area. And Doug came up to me at a presentation I made at a public library, and he said, you know, the Appalachian Trail used to run right across my grandfather's farm. Would you like to see it? And I said, of course I would. And so we got in his truck and we drove up there, and then we had to walk about half a mile because the driveway was shot and it was very wet. And you can see he's standing in front of some debris. And I'll show you why that debris is important in the story. He shared with me this photograph, which was of his grandfather's farm. Doug was raised by his grandfather. His parents had been killed in a car accident when he was very small. And so that white house in the background, Doug is standing in front of the front steps. The house was hit by lightning in the 1980s and burned, so the trail used to run across that bottom right corner of the photo. But Doug's grandfather moved the trail markers so that it went back up into the far left corner between the chicken house and the woodshed and came down past the front door. And Doug asked his grandfather once, why'd you do that? And his grandfather said, to meet the hikers, of course. They're from all over. I mean, if you grew up in Floyd County, Virginia, you'd never met someone from Connecticut or Maine or Georgia or New York. I mean, this is like saying, you know, Norway or Morocco or his grandfather would invite him in for lunch and sell him some eggs and things like that. So it was this cultural exchange that happened between people in a very rural part of Virginia and hikers who were coming up and down the Appalachian Trail. A second person who I got to know really well, I'll admit I was a little afraid of at first, and it's a man named Ralph Barnard. And everybody I would talk to during my driving around, everybody I talked to, they would say, well, of course you need to talk to Ralph Barnard, but Ralph is, well, he's a little difficult. Or one person said, crusty. He's kind of curmudgeonly. You know, he had this reputation, and so I kept putting him off, like I was going to talk to everybody else first, because I don't know, I was a little nervous by all these comments, the way people would say, oh, well, and you know, Ralph is, so finally, I called him. I had his phone number, and I called him, and he answered the phone, and I said, hello, Mr. Barnard, my name is Mills Kelly, click. So I called back, Mr. Barnard, I'm a professor at click. I mean, he assumed I was a telemarketer, because why would not he assume that? We all get plenty of those telemarketer calls. So I did an unusual thing in 2019. I sat down and I wrote him a letter. And my youngest, who at the time would have been 16 years old, he came in and he saw me there and he said, oh, is that a letter? I've never seen one. I was like, okay, I'm getting old. But and he was fascinated by the way I had addressed it and put a date on it. You know, that was cool. And so I wrote Ralph, and he called me 5 days later, and he said, oh, I'm so sorry I hung up on you. I just thought you were a telemarketer. So here's Ralph and his lovely wife, Hope, and standing in front of their house on Squirrel Spur Road in Meadows of Dan, Virginia. And some of you may have been to Meadows of Dan because you've been to the Mabry Mill along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Their house is about 3 miles from the Mabry Mill. And he doesn't look scary, does he? He's anything but. He's the sweetest guy ever. And I don't know why people said he was crusty and difficult, because I never got any of that. And so I went, and Hope made us all lunch, and we sat there on the front porch of his house, and that house, that clapboard house in the background, is the same house as Ralph was a bricklayer. And so he inherited it. He grew up, he was also raised by his grandfather, and he inherited the house from his grandfather. He still lives there today. He's 91. And he and Hope lived there, and their daughters live right next door on either side, you know, so it's all a little family compound, and it's really sweet. And But so he bricked it all up in the 1970s. But this is what it looked like in 1940. And this is a group of hikers from the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club. And they're down there to do some work on the trail in May over Memorial Day weekend. And that's Myron Avery there with the bicycle wheel in the middle. He measured everything, everything. He was a stickler's stickler. He wanted those trail guides to be exactly correct in their mileages and everything. So, but nobody had ever seen this photograph before because it was in a shoebox in Ralph's closet. It was not in an archive, just like that photo of Doug Bell's grandfather's farm. That was just in his personal scrapbook. These are photos that I got from people who've never shared those photos with anyone else. And the Barnard family home was especially important to the story of the Appalachian Trail because in the 1940s, in 1948, a writer for the National Geographic magazine, which, you know, the most important magazine in the world at the time, was he hiked along the trail, stopping in each state, and he didn't hike the whole trail, he just hiked along it. And one of the places he stayed was at the Barnard family home. And he describes in his story about it, about sitting in front of the Barnards, on the front porch of the Barnards home, and a thunderstorm has just blown through, and the swallows are flying around crazily above the grass, eating all the gnats that are coming out from the rain. You know, you've all seen that at some point in your life, and the daylilies were blooming, and and he could smell the food being prepared back in the kitchen, and his stomach was rumbling. And when I read that later, I got goosebumps. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, because when I visited with Ralph, I was sitting on his front porch when a thunderstorm had blown through and the swallows were flying all around, and I could smell Hope's cooking back in the kitchen. I had the exact same experience in 2019 that this writer for the National Geographic had in 1948. This story, by the way, that they wrote was especially important to the history of the trail because it was, first of all, it was the first national publicity for the Appalachian Trail, but also because a number of years later, 4 or 5 years later, a woman in Ohio was going back through her stack of National Geographic magazines, and almost all of us in the room will remember that it was a federal offense to throw away your National Geographic magazines. You know, we all had stacks of them in the closet. When my parents passed in 2011, that was one of the things I had to do, was we had the giant stack of National Geographics. There were 40 years worth of them. I called the public library and they just laughed at me. Like, no, we have 12 sets of those, thank you. But but this woman in Ohio read this story, and she was 67 years old, or 66, and she said to her daughter, she had outlived her abusive husband and birthed 11 children and lived on a farm, and she said to her daughter, "I'm going to go take a hike." And her daughter says later in a history that somebody did with the daughter, well, you know, that was the way my mom was. She loved to hike. What she didn't know is that her mom was going to go hike the Appalachian Trail. Her name was Emma Gatewood, known affectionately as Grandma Gatewood, and she was the first woman to hike the whole trail by herself. She wasn't the first woman to hike the whole trail. She was the third of those, but she was the first one to hike it all by herself, and she did it at the age of 67. And then she did it 2 more times for good measure, in a pair of Keds. So she didn't believe in hiking boots. So that's this story. And then the third family I want to tell you about is the Dixon family. This is Dixon's Ferry Bridge across the New River. And you can see the river's pretty wide there. The New River's a very wide river. It's ironic that it's called the New River because geologists say it's the oldest river in North America. But so that's the Dixon's Ferry Bridge. And I knew that there had been a ferry over the river when the Appalachian Trail came through, and it was called Dixon's Ferry. So I spent some time trying to track down the Dixons, and I finally did. And so I met Sally Dixon Rakes, who was the daughter of the last ferryman. The ferry went out of service in the 1960s, but her father was the last man to run the ferry. And by the time she was a girl, they were no longer doing the ferry that would take an automobile across, but they would still take just individual passengers across. So if you were a hiker on the Appalachian Trail and you were coming south, you just went to the Dixon family home and you knocked on the door, and Mr. and Mrs. Dixon would pull you across the river for a nickel. If you were hiking north, you had to stand on the far side of the river and shout until somebody heard you. And you can see, like I said, it's a wide river. And so in 2019, I interviewed a man named Gene Espy, who was the second person to hike the whole trail in 1 year. He did it in 1951. And I said to Gene, how long did you stand on the far shore of the river shouting, waiting for somebody to come get you? And he said, well, it was a long time. And he said, I don't know exactly, maybe an hour. And this is a photo of the boat that he would have been taken across on. That is Sally's grandfather and father. That's Charlie Dixon in the background. And the little boat is called Redbird. And this is what they pulled people across the river on for a nickel. And it's a little swamped in that photo. But that photo itself is only about this big. And again, it came out of a shoebox in Sally's closet. And so that's the only known photo of the Dixon Ferry. And I did ask Sally, I said, Sally, do you remember a man named Gene Espy? Because he remembered her. And so she said, oh, yes, I remember Mr. Espy, because he would send us a Christmas card every year. Her mother had gotten him across the river, and he would send us a Christmas card every year for like 20 years. He was such a nice man. And I said, well, he remembers you, and you were just a little girl, and he wanted you were hiding behind the screen door, peering out at him with your big little girl eyes, and he was trying to get you to come out, but you wouldn't. Why wouldn't you? And she said, well, he had a beard. And I said, why did that matter? And she said, well, my father had told me I should always stay away from men with beards because they were either hobos or communists. 1951, And so not long ago, I was invited to the Dixon family reunion, which is right on the river there, where they've had that property since the Revolutionary War. And so I was at the reunion, and it was great because Sally's brother, Griggs, he came up to me and he said, so I understand you're writing a book about my family. And I said, well, your family figures into the book, that's right. And he said, and I hear you're a college professor. And I said, that's right, I am. And he said, you must be a liberal. And I said, that's right, I am. And he said, well, I don't get to talk to liberals much down here. You want to sit down? And I said, sure. And so Griggs and I sat there, and we must have talked for an hour, and we discussed everything in the world except politics. He showed me a picture of a 60-pound flathead catfish his grandson had caught a couple weeks earlier, and we talked about his car that he was restoring. We talked about my kids. We talked about everything except politics. And as I was driving home, it was a good reminder. I was thinking about it, thinking it's a good reminder that, if you live in the Washington, D.C. area, you live in Richmond, you live in places where politics really matter, you start to think that they matter more than they do. And you get to the rest of the country, and they matter, but they don't matter nearly as much. What mattered was family and shared experiences. And I'll wrap up with this. When I first started talking to Ralph Barnard, he said to me, well, now, where are you from? And I said, well, I was born in Franklin County, but I lived in Northern Virginia most of my life. And he said, oh, you're from here. And I said, well, sort of, yeah. I was 6 when I moved to Falls Church. And he said, oh, well, so your people must be up there on Kelly's Knob. And I said, no, my people are from Atlanta and Tampa. And he said, yeah, but you're a Kelly, so you have to know, like, Peter Kelly, right? And I said, no, Ralph, I'm not from, I moved away in 1965 as a 6-year-old, and none of my people are from here. And he said, but you're a Kelly. And so, to him, the Kellys were from Kelly's Knob, which was 10 miles away, and so, of course, we knew each other. We're related somehow. And I had this feeling that later, after I left, he probably called somebody he knew who was a Kelly and said, now, I met one of your distant relations, But so as I was working on this book, the more I talked to people, the more I realized that the book was really about their lives and their experiences and how the Appalachian Trail mattered to them. And so I just want to read you the final paragraph from the book, and then I'll take some questions. Should have had one up here with me. Because, I didn't write this book for other historians at the university. I wrote it for you, for everybody else. So there's not a single footnote in the book, and I'm sure that some of my colleagues are a little distressed by that, but that's okay because I didn't write it for them. So I said that in the final couple of pages, I talked about all the tangible things that you could see, old trail markers that I found, or signs that, there's a street called Appalachian Trail Way, and those are all tangible things. And then I said, the intangible things are just as important. And that's because all of us have a place where we feel the most connected, the most comfortable, the place where we know the way things smell, how the wind blows, how people talk, and what everyone is eating. Even in this seemingly rootless world where jet planes shuttle millions through the air every day, where people move with increasing frequency in search of jobs, of water, security, to get away from war, fire, or famine, most humans are still rooted in their places, the places they've named, the places they know the best. In the South, that place isn't just a place, it's a home place. And home places are endowed with even greater significance than ordinary locations. Every home place, wherever it is, has its own stories. And these are some from stories that people told me during my driving around. Over there, that's where lightning hit that big tree. Or right here, that's where we first met. Or up there on the mountain, that's where those folks were lost for 3 days. Or you can see it down there where the river bends. That's where our neighbor's son found that dead bear. I heard about that dead bear from 2 different people. It was a big thing. Places become a code, a shorthand for stories that define who we are, where we've been, and who we will be. Physical geography, buildings, soundscapes, smells, they all provide boundaries, parameters for memory, for understanding, for teaching, and most of all, for belonging. But just as important as those physical things, and if not more so, are the stories. The stories the Dixon family members tell about poling hikers across the river in Redbird. Ralph Barnard's tales of hikers and their fear of panthers, and the hope that Richard Farmer still holds out for he was the mayor of the little town of Fries, that he still holds out for Fries. Dorothy Shiflett's stories of building trail with her father, and the pride in Doug Bell's voice when he talks about how the Appalachian Trail came to his grandfather's front door. In a part of America where the past really matters, the Appalachian Trail lives on, inscribed on the inner landscapes of the people who still remember and are determined not to forget. In this Appalachian heartland where people's lives are organized around stories of the past and how that past is inextricably woven into their present and their future, memories of the Appalachian Trail and their place in its history remain an important way that they make sense of their world. They wish other people remembered it the way they do, but in the end, all that really matters is that they remember the old trail. Thank you. And now we have some time we have about 15 minutes for questions. And I think Ellen has a microphone.
Well, I would like to start by asking you to put up the trail map again.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay.
You want the full trail map or just that one?
This one.
Okay.
And the blue one is the current.
The blue one is the current trail, and the red one is the old version, the original version.
I'd also like to ask a question. How many people have ever hiked on the Appalachian Trail? Oh, good.
That's wonderful. And has anybody hiked the whole thing? Good. And the reason I say good is because it's important to know that the Appalachian Trail was never intended to be a long-distance hiking trail. It was intended to be a very long hiking trail that people would hike on. And so in 1948, when the first person hiked the whole trail in 1 year, people from the Appalachian Trail Conference said, no, you didn't. Why would you do that? That's ridiculous. Nobody would do that. And they made him prove that he had actually done it. Now this year, about 2,000 people are trying to hike the whole trail, but that's 2,000 out of about 15 million people who will set foot on the trail this year, most of them for an hour or two. So congratulations to all of you who have done that.
John?
So the question is, how many people from outside the United States have hiked on the trail? and there aren't good figures on it, and the reason is because there are about 3,000 access points to the trail, places where you can get on or off easily, and so we have no way of knowing. There are no gates at any of those places, so we have no way of knowing that. However, I will say I lived in Germany in 2024. I was a Fulbright scholar teaching at a university in Germany, and when I would mention to people that I was a historian of the Appalachian Trail in Germany, they know it. They'd say, "Oh, my cousin hiked on that trail. He flew to the U.S. just to hike on that trail." So it is popular with people from outside the U.S., but how popular, we just don't know. Question right here. She's going to bring you a microphone.
Thank you. Why did they move the trail to the northwest?
So they moved the trail to the northwest for two reasons. The first of those was a problem, and that is because it was so rural, they were having a really hard time keeping volunteer labor in place to keep the trail open, because catbriers and poison ivy and everything else comes in if you don't trim it back. So that was a problem. And then secondly, during the Depression, lots of farmers abandoned their land, and so the U.S. Forest Service started buying up that land and in auctions or just buying it outright. And so the Jefferson National Forest, which is all to the west and north of the New River, expanded dramatically during that period of time and during the Depression. And so after the Second World War, there was all this federal land that they could move the trail onto to get it off of old gravel roads and things like that. And so that was the opportunity to put it on federal land where it would have more protection, and they would get some help with the trail from the Forest Service. So it's a combination of not having enough volunteers available and then having the opportunity to move it onto federal land. Yes, the book that I am talking about, get there, well, there, this one, Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail.
And that book is for sale today. He'd be
Yes.
happy to autograph it.
Yes, of
Either
course.
cash or card.
Yep.
Maybe
That's the new model in the publishing industry, by the way. Unless it's like Random House or HarperCollins, one of the really big publishers, authors are expected to sell their books. That's how it works now.
Harper's Ferry, is it still the capital of the trail, and who mans it? Are they government people or volunteers?
So Harper's Ferry is a national park, and the old historic area is a national park. So it's one of the 3 national parks that the Appalachian Trail passes through: Smokies, Shenandoah, and Harper's Ferry. And the trail itself is now a national park since 1968, but it passes through there. And so that area is actually maintained by the National Park Service. I have a question over here. What about bears? Thank you for asking about bears. This is perhaps my most common question when I tell friends of mine that I like to hike by myself, and I'm just that way. And for me, it's a kind of meditation. And so I'll tell my friends, oh yeah, I'm going, like in July, I'm going to go spend 10 days on the trail in North Carolina. And my friends will invariably say, aren't you worried about bears? And I should be more afraid of bears than I am, because I'm not afraid of them at all, because East Coast black bears are dumb. They're just dumb. And they're persistent. They're very persistent animals because they have 2 things that they're interested in: food and other bears. That's it. That's the only thing they're interested in. And I'm clearly not another bear, so the only other thing that they could be interested in is any food I might be carrying, and they're mostly afraid of humans. So they're not apex predators like grizzly bears. Grizzly bears, I am very afraid of. I would never hike alone in grizzly country. You could not pay me to do that. I know people do, but I'm not that guy. So East Coast bears, they're nothing to worry. I've been hiking on the trail since 1971. I have had 1 bear interaction, we would call it. And it was a yearling, so he was a small guy. And there'd been some Boy Scouts camping there the night before me, so they'd probably scattered some food around, and he was out. I woke up in the middle of the night. He was out snuffling around in the camping area. And so I was peering out of my tent, and then he came over, because he could smell me, so he came over to see if I might be food. And he got right up close to my tent, and he put his nose literally on mosquito netting, and I went, beat it, and bopped him on the nose, and he blasted off into the forest. That was my one bear interaction. So I'm not afraid of bears on the East Coast.
Other questions?
Yes, there's one over here. Where's the Oh, that's McAfee Knob outside of Roanoke. And that is the most photographed location on the Appalachian Trail. It's actually on a U.S. Postal Service stamp right now that you can get. And it's a promontory that sticks out over the Catawba Valley. And it looks like it's much higher up than it is. It's actually, because of the way the photo gets taken, it looks like it's a 500-foot drop off the ledge. It's really about a 50-foot drop. After you drop 50 feet, it doesn't matter, right? 50, 500, the result is the same. And but it is, yeah, it's real. That's a photo from the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club in the 1930s. And but yeah, it's a beautiful spot. But it's also a place on the trail that's being loved to death. Too many people go there.
One other question.
Yes.
Are there other sections like the one in Southwest Virginia that have been rerouted over the years?
Yes, so the question is, were there other sections that have been rerouted over the years? The next biggest rerouting was in one section, was in Georgia in 1957. The trail originally went to Mount Oglethorpe, which was closer to Atlanta, pretty close to Atlanta, maybe 30 minutes outside the city. And by the way, the trail was close to all these big cities because the trail builders wanted it to be easily accessible by train or small, cars were still rare in 1921. So they wanted it to be as close to the cities as possible so that people could go there for the day more easily. But so it went to Mount Oglethorpe, and the problem was it came off of Mount Oglethorpe, and then it crossed the valley before it got to Springer Mountain, where the terminus is today. And in between those two places were a lot of chicken farms. And if you've ever been around a southern chicken farm in July, you'll know why that was not popular with hikers, because there are few things that smell worse on this planet. And I speak from personal experience. My grandfather loved to take me to chicken farms in Georgia. And I still remember trying to not vomit in his car because of the smell. And so it was horrible. And so hikers complained about it all the time, or they would just start hiking up at Springer Mountain. So the Georgia Club finally just gave up that 37 miles, but it was 37 miles. In Maine, the trail was rerouted constantly until about 10 years ago. And that's because they originally used old, what they call tote roads for the trail that went from fish camp to fish camp to fish camp. So it was kind of civilized hiking on the trail in Maine in those days, because you could hike for 10 miles and you get to a place where they would fix you a really nice dinner. And but over the years, they wanted to make it more and more wilderness trail, and so they kept routing it away, but sort of 5 miles here, 3 miles there. And so it's an entirely different route in Maine than what it took in 1937 when it was completed, but it was all in little bits and pieces. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, this is actually about the letter that Avery wrote to the judge.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, when you read that letter, is that how you found out about the shift in the trail, or did you already know about that?
That's a wonderful question. That's where I started looking into it, because in that letter he talked about the trail running along the boundary between Floyd and Franklin County, and I thought to myself, it doesn't go there. And so now I had to answer that question. And so then I started doing more archival research. All right, so I have a question, and I would like to know who is the oldest person in the room? Oldest person in the room. Anybody over 100? Anybody over 97? Over 97? All right, you're the lucky winner. That is not a copy of my book. That is a copy of a book by a friend of mine named Dave Pruitt, and it's called Hiking the Appalachian Trail in the Virginias, Virginia and West Virginia, a Septuagenarian's Journey. He hiked the whole trail in Virginia and West Virginia in his 70s. And the photographs in that are so wonderful. You'll really enjoy it. So, and I wrote the foreword, and the press sent me 5 copies, and I only need 1. So I like to always give one away when I give a talk. So enjoy.
Mills, this is a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone coming. I'd like to say one comment to her question about bears. I was a trail maintainer for 12 years, hiking every week, and I never saw a bear, and I only saw 1 snake in 12 years. So, thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here.
If you'd like to come up and look at the books, please do.